The Tart sat untouched in front of Blake Callahan for exactly 4 seconds before he picked up his fork. He hadn't planned on eating anything that night. The meeting at his private harbor lounge had already run long, 3 of his logistics managers arguing over shipping delays while he half-listened, more interested in the dark water outside the windows than the numbers on the table. Then the server set down dessert, and the smell hit him before the plate did. Cinnamon, but not just cinnamon, something underneath it, warm and unfamiliar, like a spice he couldn't place from a kitchen he'd never been in. He took a bite anyway, mostly to be polite. Then he stopped talking mid-sentence. His logistics manager, a nervous man named Preston who'd been sweating through his collar for the last hour, blinked at the sudden silence. "Mr. Callahan?" Blake didn't answer right away. He took a second bite, slower this time, letting it sit on his tongue. 32 years old, and he'd eaten in the best restaurants 3 countries had to offer. Private chefs, flown in for single dinners, tasting menus that cost more than some men's monthly wages. He knew good food. This wasn't just good. It was specific, deliberate, like someone had built the recipe around a memory instead of a technique. "Who made this?" he said. Not a question, a demand dressed up as one. Preston looked at the other men at the table, like the answer might be written on their faces. "I'll find out." "No? Show me the kitchen." The lounge occupied the top floor of a converted freight building at the edge of Chicago's Harbor District, all exposed brick and black steel, the kind of place that photographed well and said nothing about what actually happened inside it. Blake owned it outright, though most of the staff didn't know that. He liked it that way. He liked walking through rooms and watching people work without the tension that came from knowing who was watching. The kitchen was smaller than he expected, tucked behind a service hallway that smelled like bleach and butter. Most of the day staff had already gone home. Only a handful of people remained for the overnight prep, and none of them looked up when he walked in, because none of them recognized him. That was rare enough that he almost smiled. Then he saw her. She was standing at the far counter, cleaning down the prep station with the kind of methodical care that suggested she did the same motions every night, in the same order, without needing to think about them. Late 30s, maybe. A simple gray uniform, sleeves pushed to her elbows, dark hair pulled back tight enough that a few strands had already escaped and stuck to her temple from the kitchen heat. She wasn't posed for anyone. She wasn't performing tired the way some line cooks did for sympathy. She was just tired, in the ordinary way of someone who'd been on her feet since 4 in the afternoon and still had hours left. "That's Clara," Preston said quietly, like he was worried she'd hear her own name and stop working. "She does the overnight shift. Pastry, mostly." Blake didn't answer him. He was looking at her apron string. A watch hung there, threaded through a small loop of fabric like she'd tied it on out of habit rather than fashion. Silver, tarnished at the edges, the kind of piece that had clearly been handled for years by someone who cared about it more than it was probably worth. He'd seen 100 pocket watches in his life. He'd have walked past this one without a second glance if it weren't for the engraving he could just make out from 10 feet away. Half-worn, but still legible. CC, his father's initials. Cormac Callahan. He felt something drop in his chest, cold and immediate, the kind of recognition that didn't need confirmation, because his body already knew before his mind caught up. That watch had disappeared from his father's private safe 12 years ago, during a robbery that had never been solved, that had cost 3 men their jobs and 1 man his reputation, though nobody in the syndicate ever said the second part out loud. It was supposed to be gone, sold off, melted down, buried somewhere no one would ever find it. And now it was hanging from the apron of a woman scrubbing down a steel counter at midnight, like it was nothing. "Get everyone else out," Blake said. Preston hesitated, then did as he was told, herding the other kitchen staff toward the back door with a mumbled excuse about closing early. Clara looked up then, finally noticing that something had shifted in the room, that the man standing near the doorway wasn't dressed like anyone who normally came back here. She didn't look afraid. That surprised him. "Can I help you with something?" Her voice was steady, low, the voice of someone used to strangers walking into her space and demanding things. Blake stepped closer, close enough to see the watch clearly now, close enough to see the faint scar along her knuckles, the kind that came from years of kitchen work, not violence. Close enough to see that she was watching his face, the way people watched something they were trying to decide whether to trust. "The tart," he said. "You made it." "I did. And that watch." He nodded toward it. "Where did you get it?" Something flickered behind her eyes, gone almost as fast as it appeared. Not guilt. Something closer to grief, old and worn smooth from years of carrying it. "It belonged to my husband," she said. "He's been gone a long time." Blake felt the floor of the evening shift under him, 12 years of assumptions cracking at the edges. He'd spent over a decade believing he knew exactly how that watch had left his family. Standing in this kitchen, looking at a tired woman who made pastry that tasted like memory, he understood, for the first time, that he might have been wrong about all of it. Clara set down her cleaning rag and folded her hands in front of her, the way people did when they were bracing for something. Blake noticed that too. She wasn't reaching for an excuse. She was waiting for whatever came next, like a woman who'd made peace with bad surprises a long time ago. "Let's sit," Blake said, and gestured toward the small break table shoved into the corner of the kitchen, 2 mismatched chairs, and a scarred wooden surface that had clearly seen a decade of hurried meals. She didn't move at first. "Am I in some kind of trouble?" "I don't know yet." "That depends on what you tell me." She sat, slowly, and he took the chair across from her, closer than he usually allowed himself to get to strangers. Up close, the watch looked even older than he remembered it, the silver casing worn thin at the hinge from years of opening and closing. His father used to do the same thing without thinking, flick it open and shut while he talked business, a habit Blake had hated and missed more than he expected after the man was gone. "Tell me about your husband," Blake said. Clara's jaw tightened, just slightly. "Why does that matter to you?" "Because that watch belonged to my father. It was stolen from his safe 12 years ago, and I'd like to understand how it ended up on your apron string." He watched her carefully as he said it, looking for the small tells people gave off when they were caught, the shift in the eyes, the sudden stillness. She didn't do any of that. Instead, something in her expression hardened, like a door closing. "My husband's name was Arthur," she said. "Arthur Reyes. He worked as a courier for a logistics company on the south side. Delivered packages, mostly. Sometimes he ran errands for men he didn't ask too many questions about, because the money was good and we needed it." She paused. "One night he came home with that watch, said a man gave it to him as payment for a job. He told me to keep it safe, that it was worth more than he'd normally see in a year." "Did he say who the man was?" "No, he never told me names. That was the rule he kept, even with me. He said the less I knew, the safer I'd be." Her hands, folded on the table, tightened slightly. 2 weeks later, he was gone. "Car accident," they said. "Icy road. No other vehicle involved." I never fully believed that, but I had no way to prove otherwise, and I had a mortgage, and no husband, and no answers. So I kept the watch, and I kept quiet, and I raised myself back up, the only way I knew how. Blake sat with that for a moment, the kitchen humming quietly around them, the refrigeration units cycling on and off in the background. He'd expected denial, or fear, or some clumsy story about finding the watch at a pawn shop. He hadn't expected grief this specific, this lived in. 12 years, he said. You've had it that long. 13, actually. She looked at him directly then, something steady and unafraid in her expression despite everything. I know what it must look like. A watch with someone else's initials in the hands of a widow who can't explain where her husband really got it. But I promise you, Arthur wasn't a thief. He wasn't the kind of man who took things that weren't his. If someone told you he was, they lied to you. Nobody told me anything, Blake said. The theft was never solved. 3 men lost their jobs because nobody could prove who took it, myself included in that mess, since I was the one who insisted on tightening the safe's access and still couldn't figure out how it happened. He rubbed a hand along his jaw. My father spent the last years of his life convinced someone close to him had betrayed him. It ate at him. He died still not knowing. Something shifted in Clara's face at that, quick and complicated, gone before he could name it. I'm sorry for his loss, truly. But I won't apologize for keeping something my husband gave me in good faith, especially not after everything it took for me to build a life without him. Blake studied her for a long moment. There was no performance in the way she spoke, no trembling voice calculated to earn sympathy, no rehearsed defense. Just a tired woman defending the one physical thing she had left of a man she clearly still missed. I'm not here to take it from you tonight, he said finally, but I need to understand how it got to your husband. That answer matters to me more than you know. I told you everything I have, Clara said. A man gave it to him for a job. That's all Arthur ever said. Do you remember anything else? Anything at all? A description, a place, a time of night? She hesitated, and for the first time, he saw real uncertainty cross her face, like she was digging through a memory she'd buried on purpose because it hurt too much to keep close. It was late. He came home well after midnight, which wasn't unusual, but he was different that night. Quiet, like something had unsettled him. She shook her head slowly. I asked him if everything was all right, and he just said, sometimes doing the right thing costs more than you expect it to. I didn't understand what he meant. I still don't. Blake felt the words land somewhere deep, a phrase that sounded less like something a thief would say and more like a man who'd been asked to carry someone else's guilt. I'd like to talk to you again, he said, standing. Not tonight, but soon. Clara nodded slowly, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, wary, but not hostile. The tart, she added, almost as an afterthought. You never said if you liked it. Blake paused at the door, and for the first time that night, something close to a real smile crossed his face. It was the best thing I've eaten in years. He left the kitchen with more questions than he'd walked in with, and the growing, uncomfortable sense that the story he'd believed for 12 years was about to fall apart. Blake didn't sleep that night. He drove straight from the harbor lounge to his father's old estate on the North Shore, a sprawling stone house he'd kept exactly as Cormac Callahan left it, down to the leather chair in the study that nobody sat in anymore. He hadn't been back in months. The staff kept it running, dusted and heated, waiting for a man who wasn't coming back, and Blake had never had the heart to sell it or the patience to visit it often. Tonight was different. He went straight for the safe behind the bookshelf, the same one that had been robbed 12 years ago, though it had been replaced and upgraded twice since then. Inside, along with cash reserves and old contracts nobody needed anymore, sat a stack of ledgers his father had kept by hand, refusing computers for anything he considered sensitive. Blake had gone through them once before, right after the funeral, searching for anything that might explain his father's final years of quiet paranoia. He hadn't looked closely at the entries from the year of the robbery. It had felt too raw back then, too much like picking at a wound that hadn't closed. He carried the stack to the desk and started reading. The ledgers were organized by month, his father's cramped handwriting noting deposits, transfers, and the names of men trusted with different levels of access to the estate. Blake found the month of the robbery within the first hour and began working backward from the date, looking for anything unusual in the weeks before. At first, nothing stood out. Routine entries, routine names. Then he found a discrepancy in the security log his father had kept separately, a handwritten record of who'd been given the safe's combination and when it had last been changed. According to the log, the combination had been updated 3 days before the robbery, a standard precaution his father took periodically. Only 4 people had been given the new code that week: his father, the head of estate security, a trusted accountant named Preston's uncle, and Vance, his father's advisor at the time, a man who'd worked his way up from nothing into one of the most trusted positions in the entire organization. Vance, who still sat at Blake's right hand today, older now, quieter, but no less present in every major decision Blake made. Blake sat back, staring at the name. It wasn't proof of anything. Vance had legitimate access. Half a dozen men had legitimate access to plenty of things that went missing over the years, and none of it had ever pointed to him before. But something about seeing his name on that short list, next to a security change made just days before the safe was emptied, sat wrong in Blake's stomach in a way he couldn't shake. He kept reading. The original investigation report was thinner than he remembered, tucked into the back of the ledger like an afterthought. His father had hired an outside firm to look into the theft, and the findings had been frustratingly vague. No forced entry. No evidence of the alarm being tripped. The conclusion had settled on an inside job, likely involving someone with access to both the combination and the property layout, though the investigators had never named a suspect with enough confidence to act on. Blake found something else buried in the file, a detail he didn't remember from the first time he'd read through it years ago. A note in his father's own hand, dated a week after the robbery, listing 3 names as possible suspects based on financial trouble or personal grudges. Arthur Reyes wasn't on that list. He wasn't on it at all, which meant that whatever story had circulated afterward, blaming a courier who worked odd jobs for men he didn't ask questions about, hadn't come from his father's own investigation. It had come from somewhere else. Someone else had decided Arthur Reyes was the name that fit and had made sure it stuck, quietly enough that nobody ever thought to question it, loudly enough that a widow had spent 13 years believing her husband died carrying a reputation he never deserved. Blake thought about the phrase Clara had repeated to him. Sometimes doing the right thing costs more than you expect it to. Not the words of a man confessing to theft, the words of a man who'd agreed to take something, or hide something, or say nothing, because someone convinced him it was necessary, and had paid a price for it that no one warned him about. He pulled the account records next, the ones that tracked payments made from various syndicate channels in the months following the robbery. It took him another hour of cross-referencing dates and initials before he found it. A payment routed through an intermediary account, dated 2 days after the robbery, small enough that nobody auditing the books casually would have flagged it. The kind of amount that looked like nothing unless you were specifically looking for it. The account it came from traced back, eventually, through 2 layers of shell names, to Vance. Blake sat back in his father's chair, the ledger open in front of him, the study silent, except for the low hum of the old radiator working against the night's chill. 12 years of assuming his father had simply been unlucky, robbed by some anonymous opportunist who'd never been caught. 12 years of Vance sitting across conference tables from him, offering advice, shaping decisions, mourning Cormac Callahan's death alongside the rest of the family like he hadn't played some role in the wound that never healed. It wasn't proof yet. Blake knew the difference between suspicion and evidence, and what he had in front of him was still closer to the first. But it was enough to make his hands go cold, enough to make him understand that the widow in that kitchen might have spent over a decade grieving a husband who hadn't betrayed anyone at all. He needed to find out where Arthur Reyes had really gotten that watch, and he needed to find out before Vance realized anyone was looking. Blake didn't call Clara. He decided instead to watch quietly, the way he'd learned to handle anything he didn't fully trust yet, whether it was a supplier or a story someone had told him at midnight in a kitchen. He had one of his men, a discreet driver named Otis, who'd worked for the family long enough to know when a job required silence rather than questions, follow Clara's schedule for 2 days. The reports came back thin. She worked her overnight shifts at the lounge, went home to a modest apartment on the west side, and slept through most of the daylight hours like anyone running that kind of schedule would, nothing unusual, until the 3rd day, when Otis reported she'd taken a detour after her shift ended, carrying a large box instead of heading straight home. Blake went himself the next time. He kept his distance, parked half a block down from a squat brick building with a faded sign that read Oak Ridge Senior Home, the kind of place that had clearly been operating on a tight budget for years. Paint peeling near the entrance, one of the front steps patched with concrete that didn't quite match the rest. He watched Clara walk up to the side door instead of the main entrance, carrying the same kind of box he'd seen described in Otis's report, and disappear inside. He gave it 10 minutes before he followed. The lobby smelled like coffee and antiseptic, a mix that told him everything about how the place ran, always trying to feel warm despite everything working against it. An older woman at the front desk looked up when he walked in, polite but wary of a stranger in a tailored coat who clearly didn't belong on a Tuesday afternoon visit list. "Can I help you? I'm looking for someone who might have just come in. Clara." Recognition softened the woman's face immediately. "Oh, Clara. She's probably in the kitchen, dropping off this week's batch. She's a bit of a fixture around here." The woman smiled, the kind of smile reserved for people who'd earned real affection. "Are you a friend of hers?" "Something like that," Blake said. He found the kitchen down a narrow hallway lined with framed photos of residents at holiday parties, birthdays, small moments of joy that someone clearly worked hard to create in a building that didn't have much money to spare. Clara was inside, unpacking pastries onto a cooling rack, laughing quietly with an older man in a cardigan who was clearly trying to steal one before she finished setting them out. She spotted Blake in the doorway, and her laughter faded, replaced by something more guarded. "You followed me," she said, not quite a question. "I did. I'm not proud of it, but I needed to understand something." He glanced around the kitchen, at the mismatched dishware and the handwritten menu taped to the wall. "How long have you been doing this?" Clara set down the tray she was holding. "Almost 10 years. Arthur's mother lived here before she passed. After he was gone, I kept visiting, mostly because I didn't know what else to do with myself. Eventually, I started bringing food. and it just became part of my week. And the funding? Blake asked carefully. This place doesn't look like it survives on donated pastries alone. Something flickered across her face, the same wariness he'd seen the first night in the lounge kitchen. She glanced toward the older man in the cardigan, who took the hint and shuffled off toward the dining hall with an apologetic nod. "Come with me," Clara said. She led him to a small office off the kitchen, cluttered with paperwork and a single desktop computer that looked at least a decade old. She pulled a folder from a locked drawer and set it in front of him without ceremony. "There's an account," she said. "Set up years ago, anonymous, that sends a quarterly deposit to the home. It's kept them running through 2 roof repairs and a heating system replacement that would have closed this place otherwise." She hesitated. "The account is tied to a serial number engraved inside the watch casing. Arthur showed me once, right before he was gone. He said if anything ever happened to him, I should use it to take care of his mother. And after she passed, I just kept using it for the home itself, because by then it felt like it belonged here, more than it belonged to me." Blake stared at the folder, then at her. "You've been quietly funding this place for years, using something tied to a stolen watch, and you never once tried to figure out where the money actually came from." "I tried. In the beginning." Her voice tightened. "I went to a bank once, years ago, and asked about the account. They told me it was linked to a private holding company, and that without more documentation, they couldn't tell me anything further. I was 23 years old, grieving, with no money and no legal standing to push harder. So I stopped asking, and I used what I had to make sure Arthur's mother didn't die somewhere cold and understaffed." "I'm not going to apologize for that either." Blake sat down slowly across from her, the folder still open between them. He recognized the account structure, now that he was looking at it directly, the layered ownership, the private holding company routed through channels that matched almost exactly what he'd found buried in his father's old ledgers. Whoever had set this up had access to the same financial architecture Vance had used to move money quietly for years. "This wasn't random," Blake said. "Someone built this account specifically so it could be traced back to that watch, and only that watch. Which means whoever gave it to Arthur wanted your family to have a way to survive, even if they couldn't say so out loud." Clara's expression shifted, something between confusion and a grief she'd clearly carried alone for far too long. "You think someone did this on purpose? As some kind of guilt payment?" "I think," Blake said slowly, "that whoever framed your husband for a crime he didn't commit has been quietly funding this home for over a decade, and I intend to find out exactly who that is." Vance noticed her on a Thursday afternoon, and it wasn't an accident that he did. He'd been keeping half an eye on Blake for the better part of a week, ever since the younger Callahan had started asking careful, half-disguised questions during their weekly briefings. Questions dressed up as idle curiosity about old security protocols and past incidents that Vance thought had long since been buried under newer, more pressing business. Nothing overt, nothing that would have caught the attention of anyone who hadn't spent 30 years learning to read the small shifts in a room before they turned into anything larger. But Vance had built his entire career on noticing things early, and something in Blake's tone lately had put him on edge. So when his driver mentioned, almost in passing, that Blake had been seen twice near a bakery supply store downtown, Vance decided to see for himself. He found a reason to visit the same store that afternoon, a small errand about restaurant supplies for one of the syndicate's legitimate holdings, nothing that couldn't have waited or been handled by someone else entirely. He told himself it was simple due diligence. He didn't fully believe that by the time he walked through the door. She was at the counter when he entered, a woman he didn't recognize by name, paying for a box of baking tins with the kind of careful attention people gave to money they didn't have much of to spare. Ordinary enough, until his eyes dropped to her wrist, where a thin silver chain disappeared into her sleeve, a watch clearly too large and too old-fashioned for the rest of her outfit, clipped there instead of worn properly, like she'd tucked it away out of habit rather than fashion. The engraving caught the light for half a second as she reached for her bag. C.C. Vance felt something in his chest go still and cold, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years, not since the last time he'd let himself think too long about the night that watch had left his hands and entered someone else's life. He knew immediately, with total certainty, that he was looking at Arthur Reyes's widow. He'd made sure, all those years ago, that she never knew his name. He'd made sure Arthur never knew it either. Not really. Not beyond a vague description that could have belonged to a dozen men in the organization. He'd been careful. He'd been patient, and for 12 years, that carefulness had held. Now she was standing 30 feet from him in a hardware aisle, wearing the one piece of evidence that could unravel everything. And Blake had apparently already found his way to the same bakery supply store where she shopped. Vance left without making his purchase. He sat in his car for nearly 20 minutes afterward, hands resting on the steering wheel, running through everything he knew and everything he didn't. Blake's questions during the briefings suddenly made a different kind of sense, no longer idle curiosity about old protocols, but something closer to a man quietly building a case. The timeline fit too well to be coincidence. Blake had tasted something at the lounge, gone to the kitchen, and somehow found his way to a woman Vance had spent over a decade making sure nobody ever connected to that night. He thought about Arthur first, the way he always did when this particular memory surfaced, unwanted and persistent. A quiet man, honest in the way that made him useful, someone who did jobs without asking too many questions because he needed the money and didn't have the luxury of curiosity. Vance had approached him with a simple task: deliver a package, don't open it, don't ask who it came from. He hadn't told Arthur what he was actually carrying. He hadn't told him that handing over that watch to the right person at the right time would provide Vance with an alibi solid enough to survive an internal investigation that could have ended his career, or worse. Arthur had done exactly what was asked of him. He'd delivered the watch, taken his payment, and gone home to his young wife without ever understanding what he'd actually been part of. 2 weeks later, he was finished, and Vance had told himself for years that the accident had nothing to do with him, that it was simply bad luck, icy roads, nothing more. He'd almost managed to believe it most days, but he'd never quite managed to stop the quarterly payments to that account, the one tied to the watch's hidden serial number. He told himself it was practical, a way to keep Arthur's widow financially stable enough that she'd never have a reason to go digging into her husband's death. He never let himself examine the other explanation too closely, the one where a part of him had never stopped feeling like he owed something to a dead man's family, guilt dressed up as strategy so it would be easier to live with. Now that same guilt was sitting in a bakery supply store 30 feet away, wearing a watch that could end everything he'd spent 12 years protecting. Vance started the car and drove back toward the syndicate's main office, his mind working through options with the same cold efficiency he'd used to build his career from nothing. Blake was smart, careful, and increasingly suspicious. If he'd already connected Clara to the watch, it wouldn't take him much longer to start asking about security logs and account structures from 12 years ago, and Vance's name would surface eventually, no matter how carefully he'd buried it. He needed to get ahead of it. He needed the watch gone, quietly, permanently, before it became evidence instead of a widow's keepsake. And he needed Blake distracted long enough to make that happen without raising suspicion that pointed anywhere near him. By the time he reached the office, Vance had already started making calls, reaching out to men he trusted for jobs that required discretion rather than conscience, setting quiet plans into motion to retrieve something he'd hoped, for 12 years, would simply stay forgotten in a widow's kitchen drawer. Blake asked Clara to meet him along the harbor promenade the following evening, somewhere neutral and public, a place that wouldn't feel like an interrogation the way the lounge kitchen had that first night. She arrived wrapped in a plain wool coat, her hair loose for once instead of pulled back for work, and for a moment Blake almost forgot why he'd asked her there at all. They walked slowly along the water, the lake dark and restless beside them, street lights catching the edges of the waves. "You've been careful with what you tell me," Blake said after they'd walked a while in silence. "I don't blame you for that, but I need you to trust me with more than you have so far, because I think whoever framed your husband is still close enough to hurt both of us if we're not careful." Clara's steps slowed. "What do you mean, close enough?" "I found evidence tying the theft to someone inside my own organization, someone with access to the safe's combination, and access to the kind of financial channels that could set up an anonymous account tied to a watch's serial number and keep it running for over a decade." He watched her face carefully. "I don't have a name yet, not one I can prove." Clara was quiet for a long moment, her arms wrapped around herself against the wind coming off the water. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower, more careful than before, like she was choosing each word with real weight behind it. "There's something I never told you," she said. "Something I never told anyone, because I didn't understand it myself for years, and by the time I did, I had no proof and nobody who would have believed me anyway. Tell me now." "The night Arthur brought the watch home, he wasn't alone when I saw him. I'd fallen asleep on the couch waiting for him, and I woke up when I heard voices outside the apartment door. 2 men, Arthur and someone else. I didn't recognize the second voice, but I remember what he said, because it stuck with me for years afterward." She paused, gathering herself. He said, "Nobody needs to know where this came from. Just make sure she understands it's not to be sold. Not for years, maybe not ever. Consider it insurance, in case anything ever happens to you." Blake felt something tighten in his chest. Insurance against what? "I didn't know then. I think I understand it now." She stopped walking, turning to face him fully, the wind pulling strands of hair across her face. "I think that man knew something might happen to Arthur. I think he gave him that watch as a way of making sure I'd be taken care of afterward, even if he couldn't say that out loud." "Did you ever see his face? Even briefly?" Clara shook her head. "It was dark in the hallway. I only cracked the door enough to see Arthur's back. But I remember his voice, calm, controlled, the kind of voice that sounded used to being obeyed without question." She hesitated again, longer this time, like she was working up to something she'd kept buried even from herself. "There's one more thing. Arthur mentioned a name once, weeks before he ended, when he thought I wasn't paying close attention. He was on the phone, and he said it quietly, almost like a curse under his breath. Vance. The name landed in Blake's chest, like a stone dropped into still water. "Vance," he repeated. "I never thought anything of it at the time. It could have been anyone. A supplier, a co-worker. I had no context for who that might be." Clara studied his face, and whatever she saw there made her own expression shift into something more alert, more cautious. "That name means something to you. He's my father's former advisor. My advisor now." Blake's jaw tightened as pieces he'd been circling for days finally clicked into place with uncomfortable certainty. He was one of 4 people with access to the safe's combination the week it was robbed. "I found a payment routed through his accounts 2 days afterward, small enough to look like nothing unless someone was specifically searching for it." "You think he's the one who framed Arthur?" "I think it's more complicated than that." Blake exhaled slowly, watching his breath fog in the cold harbor air. "I think Vance orchestrated the theft, needed someone outside the organization to carry the watch away so it wouldn't trace back to him during the internal investigation, and your husband was the man he chose because he was trustworthy, discreet, and desperate enough for money not to ask too many questions. Then he set up that account to keep you afloat afterward, whether out of guilt or strategy. I honestly don't know which yet." Clara's hands had curled into fists at her sides, her composure from earlier finally cracking under the weight of 13 years of grief, suddenly finding a shape and a name. If that's true, then Arthur was finished because of him. Not an accident. Because of him. "I don't have proof of that part yet," Blake said carefully, "but I intend to get it." She looked at him, something fierce and unguarded, breaking through the careful control she'd maintained since the night they met. "Then let me help you. I've spent 13 years protecting that watch, without understanding why. If it can finally clear Arthur's name, I want to be part of whatever happens next." Blake studied her for a long moment, the wind pulling at both their coats, the lake churning dark and endless beside them. He thought about warning her away, about how dangerous Vance could become once he realized how close the truth had gotten. But looking at her now, steady despite everything, he understood she wasn't the kind of woman who'd accept being protected from a fight that belonged to her. "Then be careful," he said finally, "because if I'm right about him, he already knows you exist, and men like that don't wait long once they feel cornered." Vance moved faster than Blake expected. 2 nights after the harbor conversation, Clara finished a late shift at a second job she picked up during the slower months, a small warehouse on the industrial edge of the city where she helped manage inventory for a catering supply company 3 nights a week. It wasn't work she needed to do anymore. Not really, but she'd kept the job out of habit, unwilling to give up the independence she'd built for herself over 13 years of relying on no one. Blake had assigned Otis to watch the building from a distance, quietly, without telling Clara directly, because he suspected Vance wouldn't wait long once he understood how close the truth had gotten. That instinct turned out to be correct. Otis called him a little after 11, his voice tight, in a way that told Blake everything before he said a word. 2 men just pulled up outside the warehouse, not ours. I don't recognize the plates, but the way they're parked, blocking both exits, this isn't a coincidence. Blake was already moving, grabbing his coat, calling 2 of his own men on the way to the car. "Don't approach them yet. Just keep eyes on the building until I get there." The drive took 18 minutes, that felt considerably longer. Blake ran through possibilities the entire way, none of them good. Vance wasn't a man who acted rashly, which meant if he'd sent people tonight, he'd already decided the situation had moved past the point where careful patience would protect him. That kind of decision, from a man as controlled as Vance, worried Blake more than almost anything else could have. He arrived to find the warehouse's loading dock lit by a single security light, casting long shadows across the gravel lot. 2 unfamiliar men stood near the side entrance, positioned in a way that made it clear they were waiting for someone specific to come out. not simply loitering. Otis and another of Blake's men waited near the fence line, tense but holding position exactly as instructed. Blake didn't wait for backup to organize itself properly. He walked straight toward the loading dock, his own men falling into step slightly behind him, close enough to respond if needed, far enough to let him lead. The two strangers noticed him immediately, straightening from their casual lean against the wall. "This is private property," Blake said, keeping his voice level controlled, the tone he used when he wanted a room to understand exactly who held authority in it without needing to raise his voice to prove it. "I'm going to need you to explain what you're doing here." One of the men, broader through the shoulders, stepped forward slightly. "Just picking something up, nothing that concerns you." "Everything on this property concerns me tonight." Blake let that sit for a moment, watching both men carefully, gauging how much they actually knew about who they were dealing with versus how much they'd simply been told to do a job without asking too many questions, the same trap Arthur had fallen into 13 years earlier. "Who sent you?" Neither man answered, though something in the way they exchanged a glance told Blake they weren't accustomed to being questioned this directly and weren't fully prepared for it. The side door opened before anyone could say anything further, and Clara stepped out, a bag over her shoulder, keys already in hand, clearly heading toward her car for the night. She stopped abruptly at the sight of 5 men gathered near the entrance, her eyes moving quickly between Blake and the two strangers, understanding settling over her face fast enough that Blake could see her recalculating everything about the moment. "Go back inside," Blake said quietly, without turning fully toward her. She didn't move. "What's going on? Clara, please." The broader stranger shifted his attention toward her at the sound of her name, and something in his posture changed, a small tightening that told Blake this wasn't a random errand at all. These men had been sent specifically for her, or more precisely, for whatever she still carried on her person. "The watch," Blake said, understanding arriving all at once. "You were sent for the watch." Neither man confirmed it, but their silence answered clearly enough. "Stand down," Blake said, his voice hardening now, directed at his own men as much as the strangers in front of him. "Nobody touches her. Nobody touches anything she's carrying. We have a job to do," the broader man said, though his confidence had visibly thinned in the last 30 seconds, recalculating the situation the same way Clara had. "Your job just changed." Blake stepped closer, close enough that his own men tensed on either side of him, ready but restrained. "Whoever sent you tonight sent you to steal evidence in an internal matter that doesn't concern either of you. I suggest you leave before you become part of a problem that has nothing to do with the money you were promised." The two men exchanged another glance, longer this time, clearly weighing the wisdom of pushing further against a man who was, by every visible signal in front of them, someone whose authority outranked whatever instructions they'd been given. After a long moment, the broader one gave a short nod, and both men backed toward their car without another word, pulling out of the lot with a haste that confirmed everything Blake needed to know. He turned toward Clara once the taillights disappeared down the street, finding her still standing near the door, her hand pressed flat against her chest, like she was holding something in place. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said, though her voice shook slightly on the words. That was him, wasn't it? Vance. It was his men, which means he's more afraid of what we know than I realized. Blake glanced back toward the empty lot, the security light flickering slightly overhead. "This isn't going to stop with one warning. We need to move faster than he expects." Blake called the emergency meeting for the following morning, giving himself just enough hours overnight to gather everything he needed and lay it out in an order that would leave no room for Vance to talk his way around it. He chose the boardroom at the syndicate's headquarters instead of his father's old study, a space that felt less personal and more procedural, the kind of room where decisions got made and recorded rather than argued over emotionally. He wanted Vance to understand, from the moment he walked in, that this wasn't a private conversation between two men with history. This was an accounting. 5 of his most trusted lieutenants filled the seats around the long table by the time Vance arrived, unaware of the meeting's purpose, dressed in his usual understated gray suit, the same calm expression he always wore, into rooms he expected to control. He took his customary seat near Blake's right hand without hesitation, the way he had for years, the way that had always signaled trust rather than suspicion. "You said this was urgent," Vance said, glancing around the table at the assembled faces. "What's the situation?" Blake didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened the folder in front of him and slid a single photocopied page across the table, the security log from his father's old ledger, the one listing the 4 names given access to the safe's combination the week before the robbery. Vance's eyes moved over the page. His expression didn't change, not visibly, but Blake had spent enough years watching this man negotiate impossible situations to notice the small stillness that settled over him, the kind of control that only appeared when someone understood exactly how much danger they were in. "I remember this," Vance said carefully. "The robbery. Terrible business. Never solved, as I recall." "It's solved now," Blake said. He slid a second document across the table, the payment record he'd traced through 2 layers of shell accounts back to Vance's name, the transfer dated 2 days after the theft. Then a third, the account structure funding Oak Ridge Senior Home, built on the same financial architecture Vance had used for over a decade to move money quietly through the organization without drawing attention. "Arthur Reyes," Blake continued, watching Vance's face with total focus now, "was a courier who delivered a package for you 13 years ago. A watch. You told him not to open it, not to ask questions, and to make sure his wife understood it wasn't to be sold in case anything ever happened to him." He let that sit in the silent room for a moment. Vance's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm laying out exactly what happened." Blake kept his voice level, though something cold and furious had settled into his chest overnight and hadn't left since. "You needed the watch gone from my father's safe, quickly enough to survive the internal investigation that followed. You needed someone outside the organization to carry it, someone with no connection to us, someone desperate enough for money that he wouldn't ask too many questions. Arthur fit exactly what you needed." "This is speculation built on old paperwork," Vance said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier steadiness. "It's speculation built on financial records with your name attached to them," Blake said. "Records that trace directly to an account that's been funding a senior care facility for over a decade, tied specifically to the watch's serial number. You set that account up yourself. You've been quietly paying into it for 13 years. He leaned forward slightly. "I don't think that was strategy, Vance. I think that was guilt. I think some part of you never stopped feeling responsible for what happened to Arthur Reyes, even while you let his widow believe her husband might have been a thief." The room stayed silent. The other men at the table watching Vance, now with expressions that had shifted from confusion to something harder, colder, the look of men recalculating years of trust in real time. Vance sat back slowly in his chair, and for the first time since Blake had known him, something in his composed exterior finally cracked. "You don't understand what those years were like," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of its usual authority. Your father was convinced someone close to him had betrayed him, and he was starting to look in the wrong direction, at men who had nothing to do with any of it. I panicked. I made a decision I've regretted every day since. You let an innocent man die carrying your guilt, Blake said, and you let his wife spend 13 years wondering if her husband had been a thief. I never wanted him to die, Vance said, something close to desperation entering his voice now. That accident wasn't my doing. I swear to you, whatever you think happened, I never ordered anyone to hurt him. Blake studied him for a long moment, weighing the words against everything he'd uncovered over the past week. He believed, on some level, that Vance hadn't directly caused Arthur's death. But belief in that single point changed nothing about everything else: the theft, the frame job, the years of silence that had allowed an innocent family to carry a stranger's guilt without ever understanding why. It doesn't matter what you intended, Blake said finally. What matters is what you did and what it cost. You're finished here, Vance. Effective immediately. He nodded toward the two lieutenants, seated closest to the door, men whose loyalty had never wavered, who now stood, without needing further instruction. Vance didn't resist as they moved toward him, his shoulders finally dropping under the weight of 13 years, catching up to him all at once. As he was led from the room, he looked back once toward Blake, something almost like relief crossing his face. The particular relief of a man who'd finally stopped having to carry a secret alone. The days after Vance's removal moved differently than Blake expected, quieter than the chaos he'd braced for. He'd worried that stripping a man of 30 years standing might shake the organization's stability, that other lieutenants might see weakness in the sudden change or start jockeying for the space Vance left behind. Instead, what he found was something closer to relief settling over the people around him. The same unspoken tension he'd noticed in the boardroom finally allowed to exhale. He met with his legal team on the third day, a small office of lawyers who handled the organization's more delicate matters, the kind of work that required discretion as much as expertise. He laid out everything he'd gathered: the ledgers, the payment records, the original investigation file that had never named Arthur Reyes as a suspect despite the story that circulated afterward. "I want his name cleared," Blake told them, "formally, in every internal record that still references the robbery. I want it documented that Arthur Reyes was not responsible for what happened to my father's property." The lead attorney, a careful woman named Priya, who'd worked with the family for over a decade, studied the file for a long moment before responding. "This will take some restructuring of the old records, but it's possible. May I ask what prompted this, after so many years?" "His widow deserves to know the truth," Blake said simply. "She spent 13 years believing her husband might have been a thief. That ends now." It took most of the day, cross-referencing dates and testimonies, drafting language that would sit permanently in the syndicate's private files, the kind of documentation that would never appear in any public record, but would matter enormously to the small circle of people who'd once believed Arthur guilty. Blake sat through most of it himself, unwilling to leave the work to others when it came to correcting a wrong that had followed him personally for over a decade. By evening, the document was finalized, a formal internal exoneration stating clearly that Arthur Reyes had been an unwitting courier in a theft orchestrated entirely by Vance, that he had carried the watch without knowledge of its origin or significance, and that any suspicion cast on his character in the years following his death had been unfounded and unjust. Blake drove to Clara's apartment that night, the document folded carefully in an envelope, unwilling to wait even one more day to give her something she'd been owed for 13 years. She opened the door, looking tired, still in her work clothes from an earlier shift, surprise flickering across her face at finding him there, unannounced. "I have something for you," Blake said. She let him in, and he watched her read the document at her small kitchen table, watched her hands begin to shake somewhere around the second paragraph, watched tears she clearly hadn't expected slip free before she'd finished reading it fully. "It's official," Blake said quietly. "Recorded, permanent. Nobody in the organization will ever question his name again." Clara set the paper down carefully, like it might tear if she held it too tightly, and pressed both hands over her mouth for a long moment before she could speak. 13 years, she said finally, her voice thick. 13 years, I told myself it didn't matter what other people believed, that I knew the truth even if nobody else did. But it mattered. It mattered so much more than I let myself admit. "I'm sorry it took this long," Blake said. "I'm sorry my organization let that story stand for as long as it did." She wiped her eyes, composing herself slowly, and looked at him with an expression that had shifted since the night they'd first met in that kitchen, something warmer now, less guarded. "You didn't have to do any of this. You could have taken the watch back that first night and walked away with your answer. Instead, you spent a week tearing apart your own organization to give a stranger's memory some peace." "You're not a stranger," Blake said, surprising himself slightly with how easily the words came. "Not anymore." Clara studied him for a long moment, something quiet passing between them that neither of them named directly. Then she looked back down at the document on the table, running her fingers gently across Arthur's name printed there, finally cleared after 13 years of silence. "What happens now?" she asked. "With Vance, I mean. Legally. That's still being decided," Blake admitted. "He's out of the organization completely. That much is final. Whether there's further legal exposure for what he did to your husband, that's something my lawyers are still working through carefully. I want to be certain we handle it in a way that actually protects you and doesn't just create more chaos around something you've already carried long enough." "And the senior home?" Clara asked. "The funding. It was tied to the watch's serial number. If that account gets tangled up in whatever happens with Vance, the home could lose everything overnight." Blake hadn't fully considered that risk until she said it aloud, and something tightened in his chest at the thought of the residence he'd seen briefly during his visit, the framed photographs of holiday parties lining that narrow hallway. "I'll make sure that doesn't happen," he said. "Whatever else gets resolved with Vance, the home's funding stays protected. That's not negotiable." Clara nodded slowly, some of the tension easing from her shoulders for the first time since he'd arrived. "Thank you," she said. "For all of it, I don't think I've said that yet, properly." "You don't need to thank me," Blake said. "I should have found this answer years ago, if I'd looked harder after my father died. You paid the price for that failure far longer than you should have." She didn't argue the point, though something in her expression suggested she didn't entirely agree with him carrying that guilt either. Instead, she simply reached across the table and rested her hand briefly over his, a small, steadying gesture between two people who'd spent the past week untangling a decade of buried grief together. Blake spent the better part of a week working with his legal team to structure something permanent for Oak Ridge Senior Home, something that wouldn't depend on a watch's hidden serial number or an anonymous account that could be frozen the moment Vance's legal situation became more complicated. He wanted it clean. He wanted it public, at least within the small circle that mattered, and he wanted it entirely disconnected from anything that could be traced back to the theft that had started all of this. He asked Clara to join him for the meeting with the home's board, a request she accepted with visible nervousness when he called to explain what he had in mind. "You want me in the room," she said. "Why?" "This is your money, your arrangement. Because you're the reason this place has survived the last decade," Blake said. "Whatever gets set up going forward, it should have your name on it too, not just mine." The board met in a cramped room at the back of the facility. 4 elderly volunteers and the administrator Blake had spoken with briefly on his first visit, all of them clearly unused to meetings involving anyone in a tailored suit. Clara sat beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the same posture she'd held that first night in the lounge kitchen when she thought she might be in trouble. Blake laid out the proposal without unnecessary preamble. A permanent endowment, funded directly through legitimate syndicate corporate assets rather than the private account tied to the watch, structured so that Oak Ridge would receive guaranteed quarterly funding regardless of anything happening elsewhere in his organization. Enough to cover the roof, the heating system, staff wages that had clearly been stretched thin for years, and a reserve fund large enough that the board wouldn't need to worry about sudden gaps again. The administrator, a soft-spoken woman named Dorothy, who'd run the place for nearly 15 years, looked between Blake and Clara with something like disbelief. "This is considerably more than we've ever received from any single source. May I ask, what prompted this kind of generosity?" Blake glanced at Clara before answering, giving her the space to decide how much of the story she wanted shared. She nodded slightly, giving him permission. "My family owed a debt to someone connected to this facility," Blake said carefully, keeping the explanation simple without dragging the board into details that weren't theirs to carry. "This is part of correcting that. Clara has quietly supported this place for years, using funds that came with complications neither of us fully understood until recently. I want to make sure the home's future doesn't depend on those complications anymore." Dorothy looked toward Clara, warmth spreading across her face. "You never told us how you managed to keep sending those deposits every quarter, all these years. We assumed you had some family money set aside." "It's a longer story than I ever wanted to explain," Clara said quietly. "I'm glad it can finally be simpler." The board reviewed the paperwork Blake's legal team had prepared, asking careful questions about the terms, the permanence of the arrangement, whether it could be revoked or altered later by anyone else in his organization. Blake answered each one directly, having anticipated the concerns after years of watching people distrust arrangements that seemed too generous to be real. By the end of the meeting, the endowment had been formally accepted, signed and notarized on the spot, a legal structure that no longer depended on anything connected to Vance or the watch or a theft that had happened long before most of the people in that room had ever set foot in the building. Clara stayed quiet through most of the signing, watching the paperwork move across the table with an expression Blake couldn't fully read until they stepped outside afterward, into the cool afternoon air of the parking lot. "It's strange," she said, looking back at the building. "For 13 years, keeping this place funded felt like the only thing I had control over, the one piece of Arthur's memory I could actually protect with my own 2 hands. Now, it's protected without needing me at all. That doesn't mean it doesn't need you," Blake said. "The board just watched you sit in that room and vouch for an arrangement worth more money than most of them will see in their lifetime. They trust you because you earned that trust 1 quarterly deposit at a time, long before I ever walked into your kitchen." Clara was quiet for a moment, considering that. "I suppose I don't have to carry it alone anymore, though. That's what's strange about it. I got so used to carrying things by myself that I forgot what it felt like to have someone share the weight." "You won't have to carry any of it alone from here," Blake said. "Not the home." Not Arthur's name. None of it. She looked at him then, something steady and unguarded in her expression. 13 years of careful self-reliance, settling into something that finally felt a little lighter. What happens to the watch now? It's not needed for the funding anymore. It's just a watch again, I suppose. Yours, technically, since it belonged to your father. Blake considered the question longer than he expected to. I think it should stay with you a while longer, he said finally. It's carried enough weight for both our families over the years. I'm not in any hurry to take it back. Clara's fingers went instinctively to the chain at her wrist, the watch that had started as evidence of a stolen crime and slowly become something closer to a shared history between two families who'd never intended to be connected at all. Thank you, she said simply, and for the first time since that first night in the kitchen, her smile reached all the way to her eyes. Blake found the storefront almost by accident, driving through the north side one afternoon with no particular destination in mind, still turning over the last loose thread of the past 2 weeks. It sat on a corner lot, between a flower shop and a bookstore, a historic building with tall windows and old brick that had clearly been something grand decades ago, before falling into quiet disrepair, currently empty, a faded lease sign taped crookedly in the window. He stopped the car, without fully deciding to. Inside, the space still held traces of its original character: ornate tin ceilings, a long marble counter that some previous owner had never gotten around to removing, tall windows that would flood the room with morning light, exactly the kind of light that mattered for a bakery. He walked through it slowly, picturing shelves of pastries, the smell of cinnamon, and something unfamiliar drifting out onto the sidewalk the way it had drifted through his lounge weeks earlier. Unforgettable enough to pull a stranger straight off the street. He bought it within the week, quietly, through the same legal team that had handled the endowment for Oak Ridge, structuring the deed so it would transfer cleanly and permanently into Clara's name alone, with no strings attached to his organization, no complications that could ever be traced back to a stolen watch or a man who'd spent a decade paying off his guilt from a distance. He didn't tell her until the deed was finalized. He asked her to meet him there on a Sunday afternoon, giving no explanation beyond an address and a time. She arrived in her plain wool coat again, hair loose the way it had been that evening on the harbor promenade, and stopped short on the sidewalk when she saw the building, its windows freshly cleaned, a simple brass key already waiting in Blake's outstretched hand. "What is this?" she said slowly, though something in her voice suggested she already suspected. "It's yours," Blake said. "Free and clear. Your name on the deed, your bakery, your terms entirely. No connection to the syndicate, no strings, nothing that could ever be taken back or complicated later." Clara stared at him, then at the building, then back at him again, clearly struggling to find words adequate to the moment. "Blake, this is too much. I can't accept something like this. You spent 13 years quietly holding a family together with nothing but pastry and stubbornness," Blake said. "You kept a senior home running on money you didn't even understand the source of, because you believed it was the right thing to do. You never once asked for anything in return, not for yourself. I'm not giving you this because you asked for it. I'm giving it to you because you earned it a long time before I ever walked into your kitchen." She took the key slowly, turning it over in her palm, her eyes bright with tears she was visibly trying to hold back. "I don't know how to thank you for something like this." "You don't have to," Blake said. "Just fill it with something as good as that tart. That's payment enough." They walked through the empty space together, Clara already narrating where she'd put the ovens, the display cases, the small round tables she imagined near the front windows for customers who wanted to sit and watch the street. Blake listened, something settling comfortably in his chest that he hadn't expected to feel this easily, watching 13 years of quiet grief slowly giving way to something that looked, for the first time, like genuine excitement about the future. Near the back of the space, close to where the kitchen would eventually be built, Clara stopped and reached for the chain at her wrist, unclasping the watch carefully and holding it out toward him. "I think it's time this came back to you," she said. "It's done what it needed to do. It kept my family afloat when I had nothing else. It led you to the truth about Arthur, and it helped fund a home that means more to me than almost anything else in the world. But it belongs to your family, not mine. It always did." Blake looked at the watch resting in her open palm, the same one he'd noticed that first night, tarnished silver, catching the afternoon light through the tall windows. He thought about his father, about the years of quiet paranoia that had followed him after the theft, about how strange it felt to finally understand the truth behind something that had haunted their family for over a decade. He closed her fingers gently back around it, instead of taking it. "Keep it," he said, "not as evidence anymore, just as something that connects two families who never should have been strangers to begin with." He paused, something warmer entering his voice. "Besides, I have a feeling I'll be back here often enough that I won't need it to remember where you are." Clara laughed then, real and unguarded, a sound Blake realized he hadn't heard from her before. Not fully, not without some weight of grief sitting underneath it. "You're welcome here any time," she said, "though I should warn you, once this place opens, you'll have to wait in line with everyone else for a table." "I can live with that," Blake said, smiling. Outside, the afternoon light stretched long across the empty storefront, the beginning of something neither of them had expected when a Tart landed on a table in a harbor lounge weeks earlier. Arthur's name had been cleared. The senior home stood secure for years to come. And in the quiet space between two families, finally free of a secret that had cost them both more than either had ever known, something new had begun to take shape. Patient and unhurried, built the same way Clara built everything that mattered, with care, with time, and with the kind of quiet strength that had carried her through 13 years alone, and would carry her, Blake suspected, into whatever came next.